The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw European expansion into Africa, driven by economic ambitions and political rivalries. France emerged as a dominant force, carving out a vast colonial empire across North, West, and Central Africa. This period, known as the Scramble for Africa, shaped the continent's political boundaries and social fabric. French ambitions were fueled by a desire for new markets and raw materials. Africa's resources presented an enticing opportunity for French capitalists. Beyond economics, France sought national pride and global competition. Colonies symbolized national prestige and power. The French colonial project was also about cultural superiority. The policy of assimilation aimed to transform African societies in the image of France. This involved imposing French language, legal system, and cultural norms. While advancements in infrastructure, education, and healthcare occurred, they served French interests. The colonial experience was marked by exploitation and suppression of African voices. The legacy of French colonialism in Africa is complex and multifaceted. French colonialism led to infrastructure development like roads and railways, facilitating trade and communication. French education and legal systems were introduced, impacting the political and intellectual landscape. However, these developments came at a high cost, built on economic exploitation. Arbitrary borders drawn by the French created tensions that continue today. African leaders and intellectuals played a pivotal role in challenging French rule and advocating for independence. The end of formal colonial rule did not mark the end of French influence in Africa. The latter half of the 19th century witnessed a dramatic escalation in European interest in Africa, transforming the continent into a chessboard for imperial ambitions. This period, known as the Scramble for Africa, saw European powers, including Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and Spain, engage in a frenzy of exploration, conquest, and colonization, seeking to carve out their own spheres of influence. Prior to the scramble, European presence in Africa had largely been confined to coastal trading posts and settlements with limited penetration into the interior. However, several factors contributed to the sudden surge in European expansionism. The Industrial Revolution had created a voracious appetite for raw materials such as rubber, timber, diamonds, and gold, which Africa possessed in abundance. Simultaneously, European industrial powers sought new markets for their manufactured goods, and Africa, with its large population, presented a potentially lucrative outlet. Beyond economic considerations, the scramble for Africa was also fueled by intense political rivalries among the European powers. As European nations competed for global dominance, the acquisition of colonies became a key marker of national prestige and power. Each power sought to outmaneuver its rivals and secure the largest and most resource-rich territories, often resorting to military force and diplomatic maneuvering to achieve their aims. France, still smarting from its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, played a leading role in the scramble for Africa. French ambitions were driven by economic interests and political calculations. Economically, Africa was a vital source of raw materials and a market for manufactured goods. Politically, France aimed to rival Great Britain and Germany. Acquiring colonies enhanced French prestige and power. France sought a contiguous bloc across West Africa, linking Senegal and Algeria. This brought France into competition with Great Britain. Section 3. The price of prestige, establishing a global footprint. France's colonial ambitions in Africa were intertwined with the belief in its own cultural and racial superiority. The civilizing mission posited it was Europe's duty to bring progress to Africa. French rule aimed to uplift Africans by introducing French language, culture, and technology. The scramble for African territories led to brutal wars, displacement, and exploitation. Seeds of empire on the Senegalese coast. France's presence in Africa predated the scramble for Africa by centuries. By the 17th century, French traders had established footholds in Senegal. These interactions focused on trade, including gold, ivory, gum, Arabic, and enslaved Africans. French trading posts served as outposts of commerce and expansion. Relationships with local rulers were often exploitative. Senegal's strategic importance was key for French imperial ambitions. France expanded its influence, consolidating key trading posts. Local resistance and European rivalry posed challenges. The competition for Senegal mirrored the larger scramble for Africa. Section 2, the Algerian Prize. Strategic importance and brutal conquest. The French conquest of Algeria in 1830 marked a decisive turning point in France's colonial ambitions in Africa. Algeria's strategic location on the Mediterranean held immense importance for the French. Control over Algeria secured French naval dominance and provided a springboard for further expansion. Algeria's fertile plains and untapped mineral resources offered economic allure. The conquest was brutal, marked by fierce resistance from the indigenous population. The conflict left a legacy of resentment and animosity. The French victory marked the beginning of a long and troubled chapter in Franco-Algerian relations. Section 3. A troubled dual resistance and uprising in Algeria. The French conquest of Algeria ignited a smoldering resistance throughout the 19th century. French rule, marked by land confiscations and cultural suppression, was deeply resented. Algerian resistance ranged from sporadic defiance to organized uprisings. Emir Abdelkader united tribes in a fierce struggle against French domination. His guerrilla tactics inflicted costly defeats on the French army. Despite his capture in 1847, the spirit of resistance remained unbroken. Uprisings continued, fueled by grievances over land, politics, and culture. The French army's scorched earth policy sought to crush rebellion. The struggle for Algeria shaped the destiny of both nations for generations. Conquests and consolidations. With Algeria under control, France turned southward to West Africa. The region, a tapestry of diverse cultures and kingdoms, presented opportunities and challenges. Driven by economic greed and strategic calculations, French forces embarked on military campaigns and alliances. Starting from Senegal, the French extended inland, facing fierce resistance. The conquest was a patchwork of campaigns, treaties, and betrayals. Key figures included Louis Faidherbe and Joseph Gallieni. By the early 20th century, France had established a vast colonial empire in West Africa. Administered from Dakar, French West Africa became a cornerstone of France's colonial empire. The lure of resources, rubber, timber, and the race for riches. France's expansion into West Africa was driven by economic imperatives. The region was seen as a treasure trove of natural resources. Rubber, timber, and groundnuts were in high demand in Europe. French companies established plantations and logging concessions, displacing local communities. The rubber boom had a transformative impact on West Africa. France encouraged rubber cultivation, often through coercive labor practices. African farmers were forced to abandon traditional crops for rubber. The pursuit of rubber profits led to environmental degradation and social upheaval. West Africa's forests were targeted for valuable timber. French logging companies felled trees at an alarming rate. The timber trade contributed to deforestation and biodiversity loss. Section 3. Central African Frontiers. Navigating rivers and asserting dominance. France's imperial gaze turned eastward to Central Africa's dense rainforests and sprawling savannas. This region, crisscrossed by mighty rivers, presented challenges and opportunities for French expansion. Navigating treacherous rivers and contending with tropical diseases were central to France's pursuit of empire. Pierre Sévigné de Brazza, an Italian-born explorer, played a key role in French colonization. Brazza sought to establish French influence through diplomacy and exploration. His expeditions up the Congo River solidified French claims, leading to the creation of French Congo. However, the French presence led to widespread exploitation and abuses. The construction of the Congo Ocean Railway came at a horrific human cost. France's expansion brought conflict with Belgium, highlighting the ruthless competition for resources. Section 1. The Civilizing Mission, a Flawed Ideal. At the heart of the French colonial project lay a belief in the inherent superiority of European civilization, justifying the subjugation of millions of Africans. The civilizing mission posited it was the duty of European powers to bring progress to Africa. This worldview blinded many to the rich cultures and histories of African societies. The mission reshaped African societies in the image of France, imposing language, legal systems, and cultural norms. The French system sought direct control, unlike the British model of indirect rule. The civilizing mission assumed African cultures were inferior and needed European guidance. This attitude was reflected in the actions of many French colonial officials. The French education system aimed to instill French values, often ignoring local knowledge. The civilizing mission served to maintain French dominance and exploit African labor and resources. The imposition of French culture was linked to the economic and political goals of French colonialism. The civilized African, in the eyes of many French administrators, adopted French customs and contributed to the French Empire. Section 2. Assimilation in Theory and Practice, A Tale of Two Africas. Central to the French colonial project was the policy of assimilation, aimed at transforming African subjects into French citizens. Through education and cultural immersion, Africans were expected to adopt French language and values. This vision clashed with colonial power dynamics and deep-seated prejudices. The promise of assimilation remained elusive for most Africans. Discriminatory laws and cultural biases hindered the path to French citizenship. Even those who attained citizenship faced prejudice and were denied full rights. Most Africans were relegated to the status of subjects facing exploitation and limited opportunities. They bore the brunt of forced labor and cultural suppression. The French administration entrenched racial and cultural divisions. Assimilation created alienation and cultural dislocation among Africans. Many struggled to reconcile their identities with colonial demands. This dissonance fueled resentment and resistance, leading to anti-colonial movements. Section 3. Education, Language, and the Reshaping of Identity. The French colonial administration used education to instill French language, culture, and values in young Africans. The system aimed to create a class of evolved Africans, fluent in French and loyal to France. This educated elite would serve as intermediaries, promoting French cultural influence. Fluency in French opened doors to government positions and social mobility. Those who mastered French were seen as more civilized and deserving of privileges. This linguistic hierarchy impacted the social and cultural landscape, relegating African languages to the private sphere. The curriculum focused on French history and culture, neglecting African heritage. This education system contributed to cultural alienation and historical amnesia. The legacy of French colonial education continues to shape African societies, highlighting education's power as both a tool for liberation and control. Section 1. Extracting Wealth, the Foundations of French Prosperity. The French colonial project in Africa was fundamentally an economic enterprise. From trading posts to plantations and mines, extracting African wealth enriched France and fueled its industrial ambitions. French capitalists, backed by the colonial administration, exploited Africa's natural resources, including rubber, timber, minerals, and cash crops. Profits flowed back to France, enriching colonial administrators and shareholders, while African economies remained underdeveloped. This system of economic exploitation, deeply intertwined with racial hierarchies, left a lasting legacy of inequality in Africa. Section 2. Cash crops and coercion transforming African economies. The French colonial administration coerced African farmers to shift from subsistence farming to cultivating cash crops for export. This shift led to a decline in food security and made African farmers vulnerable to famines and economic hardship. Forced labor practices enriched European plantation owners while trapping many Africans in poverty. The environmental impact was significant, with deforestation, soil erosion, and loss of biodiversity. The pursuit of profit often came at the expense of environmental sustainability and the well-being of local communities. Section 3. Infrastructure of extraction, serving the needs of empire. The French colonial administration built infrastructure to facilitate the extraction and transportation of raw materials to Europe. Railways and roads connected resource-rich regions with ports serving the colonial economy. The construction of railways and roads often came at a high human cost, with African laborers subjected to harsh conditions. Ports like Dakar, Abidjan and Douala became vital hubs for the colonial economy. This infrastructure reinforced economic dependency and strengthened French control over its colonies. Section 1. Defiance in the face of conquest. Early resistance movements. African societies resisted French conquest, defending their lands and cultures. Early resistance movements laid the groundwork for broader anti-colonial struggles. From Algeria to West Africa, Africans employed guerrilla tactics against French invaders. Leaders like Samori Touré and the Kabyle people exemplified African defiance. These rebellions, though often suppressed, symbolized African resistance. Early acts of resistance inspired future generations to fight for liberation. Section 2. Leaders and legends. Icons of African resistance. African leaders emerged, challenging French rule and mobilizing their people. El Hadj Oumar Tall and Blaise Diagne were notable figures in the resistance. Women like Queen Mother Yaa Asantewaa played pivotal roles in resistance movements. The Negritude movement, led by Leopold Sédar Senghor, celebrated African culture and identity. These leaders and movements laid the intellectual foundations for independence. Their stories of courage and determination became symbols of African resistance. Section 3. Seeds of Liberation. The rise of African nationalism. African nationalism grew in the early 20th century, fueled by shared grievances and Pan-African consciousness. African soldiers returning from World War I demanded greater autonomy. Nationalist movements, led by intellectuals and activists, challenged the colonial status quo. The Negritude movement, founded by Senghor, Césaire and Damas, inspired African intellectuals. World War II further weakened European empires and emboldened colonized peoples. The stage was set for the final struggle for African independence. The winds of change, the post-war push for self-determination. The end of World War II ushered in an era of global transformation, weakening European empires. The rise of the United States and the Soviet Union further destabilized the colonial system. Nationalist movements gained momentum, demanding an end to colonial rule. French leaders faced mounting pressure to confront the inevitability of decolonization. The French response was initially hesitant, with some advocating for continued guidance and others recognizing the need for a pragmatic approach. Uneven paths to freedom, negotiating independence, and its aftermath. Decolonization in French Africa was neither uniform nor without challenges. The path to independence varied significantly, shaped by nationalist movements and French interests. Guinea chose immediate independence, facing economic hardship and isolation. Senegal and Ivory Coast pursued gradual autonomy before full independence. The transition was often fraught with tension, violence, and uncertainty. French authorities sometimes clung to power, using repression and divide-and-rule tactics. The Algerian War of Independence was a brutal conflict, highlighting the human cost of decolonization. Even peaceful transitions left a legacy of colonialism. Arbitrary colonial borders created lasting divisions and conflicts. Economic dependence and French influence persisted through agreements and alliances. The end of colonial rule marked a new chapter, but deep-seated inequalities remained. A continent scarred yet resilient, the enduring impact of French colonialism. French colonialism in Africa left an indelible mark on political, economic, and social landscapes. It brought infrastructure, education, and administration, but at a steep price. Railways and roads connected regions, while education provided new opportunities. Yet, economic exploitation and forced cultivation disrupted traditional practices. Arbitrary borders sowed seeds of future conflicts. Despite cultural alienation, African cultures proved resilient, adapting and evolving post-colonialism. Navigating the post-colonial landscape, echoes of the past, hopes for the future. The end of formal colonial rule in French Africa did not mark the end of French influence. The relationship between France and its former colonies, often described as Franc-Afrique, has remained close, complex, and often controversial. Economic ties persist, with French companies maintaining a significant presence in many sectors of African economies. French political and military influence continues to shape events in the region. The challenges faced by newly independent African nations have been immense. The legacies of colonialism have proven difficult to overcome, yet despite these challenges, there is also hope. A new generation of African leaders and citizens is emerging, determined to build a brighter future for Africa.